During today's legal update, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. As you may have noticed, the panel discussion that is taking place after this, which has been pre-recorded, is around retirement reform in South Africa and the papers that were published late last year. So what I'm going to be doing today is providing you with some context and detail around those papers so that you can go into that panel discussion with full understanding of what the panelists are going to be talking about. So on my agenda today, I'm first going to be giving you a brief introduction to the papers that were published. We're then going to talk about the national context within which these papers were written. And then I'm going to be giving you some detail around the two-part system proposal, as well as certain tax proposals that were included in that paper. I'm then going to be touching very briefly on the governance of umbrella funds paper, which I don't think you as advisors need to know too much about. It really impacts umbrella fund trustees, sponsors, and administrators more than anyone else. So we're not going to spend too much time on that, but if you are a retirement benefit counselor, or a retirement benefit consultant, and would like more information on that paper, we would be happy to answer your questions after the webinar. And then lastly, I'm going to be talking about the hot topic of the moment, the increase to the offshore investment limits that you would have heard about in the press over the last week or so. Right, so let's jump in and talk about the papers that were published on the 14th of December last year. As usual, National Treasury and the FSCA love to publish documents for public comment just before we all go on holiday at the end of the year, and they like to get comments on those documents just after we get back. So last year was no exception, and on the 14th of December they published these two extensive papers, the first being entitled Encouraging South African Households to Save More for Retirement, which has been commonly referred to as the two-part system paper, and the second one was the Governance of Umbrella Funds paper. I've provided links on this slide to National Treasury's website if you haven't had a chance to read through those papers before. But if you haven't had a chance, don't worry, because we're going to be touching on most of the important points here today. So let's look at the national context, because I think it's really important that we understand where government is coming from when they publish proposals and changes to policy. So why has National Treasury published these papers, and why now? As you probably already know, government has been working progressively to reform and restructure the retirement savings framework since 2012. And over the course of the last decade, they have published a number of amendments to legislation, most recently being the harmonization of provident and pension funds, which you know was implemented in March last year. But in addition to this regulatory framework backdrop, we also know that South African households currently do not save sufficiently for retirement or for their short-term needs. Average household savings in South Africa are just above 2% of GDP per annum, which is incredibly low. And this consists mostly of contractual savings in retirement funds. But even so, the replacement values that we're looking at on retirement are still very low and are averaging at around 25 to 30%. Part of what's adding to this low savings rates and low replacement values is leakage from retirement funds. And when we talk about leakage, we're really talking about members accessing withdrawal benefits prior to retirement, so when they change jobs, resign, or are retrenched. In addition to this, as we've already said, discretionary savings in South Africa are very low, and many South Africans are incredibly financially stressed. In an Old Mutual survey that was conducted last year, 34% of respondents stated that they did not have enough savings to last them for more than a month if they were to lose their primary source of income. And over 50% stated that they were incredibly stressed and overwhelmed with their financial situation. So with this backdrop in mind, government wants to promote a better savings culture in South Africa by encouraging increased retirement savings and preservation until retirement, and ensuring that retirement funds are well governed and efficiently managed in order to promote good outcomes for members. In addition to this, government also wants to give people access to their retirement savings at the times when they need them most. As you will have noted during the national lockdowns that happened during the COVID pandemic over the last 2 years, South Africans really did need to access their retirement savings in times of need, and this wasn't an option for most members unless they lost their jobs. So there are also outstanding reforms to the retirement system that have been considered over the course of the last 10 years that have not yet been implemented. And there are 3 main ones that government is looking at. The first is coverage. There are still significant categories of workers that are not participating in any kind of retirement scheme. So government wants to increase retirement savings coverage. The second is preservation, which we've already spoken about. The issue being that very few members preserve all of their savings until retirement and tend to cash out when they change jobs. And then the third issue that government is worried about is costs within a retirement fund and whether members are really receiving good value for money. So the first 2 outstanding reforms on the slide are dealt with in the 2-pot system paper. And the third one on costs is dealt with in the umbrella funds governance paper, which we're not going to be talking about in too much detail. Right, so let's look at this 2-pot system proposal and what it means. There are 2 major concerns that National Treasury has identified with the current retirement savings system. The first is that there are currently insufficient preservation of retirement fund savings before retirement. We've already said this a number of times in this presentation. The second is that individuals who are in financial distress can only access their retirement savings if they resign or are retiring or terminate their employment for some other reason. And if you look at these 2 problems, it's easy to see that they're in direct opposition to each other. So government is aware that any reform should strive to find the right balance to solve both problems simultaneously. One that promotes preservation, but also allows for some flexibility that works in members' long-term interests. And that is a direct quote from the papers. So what does this 2-pot system look like? At its most basic, all contributions made from the implementation of the new system will be split. The first split will be 1/3 of that contribution, which will be paid into a pot that will be accessible at any time prior to retirement. The accessible pot, they're thinking about ensuring that members can have access to 1 withdrawal per annum, which makes a lot of sense, but government have also been toying with the idea of allowing a second withdrawal in the same year. They're thinking about this because they say that this might dissuade members from withdrawing their total allowance in their first opportunity if they know that they have a second opportunity coming up later in the year. But considering the enormous cost and administrative burden of allowing for second withdrawal in each year, we really don't think that there's a sufficient benefit to outweigh that cost and administrative burden. So hopefully we're looking at just 1 withdrawal per year, but it's important to remember that that 1 withdrawal would be to the entire amount that's available in that accessible pot. In order to dissuade members from withdrawing more than they need, government has also suggested that retirement funds ensure that all members withdrawing from this pot are given some form of retirement benefit counselling. This counselling would then explain to them exactly what it means to be withdrawing and how that might impact on their long-term retirement savings, and perhaps also encourage them to contribute more in future to make up for the amount withdrawn. The balance, so 2/3 of your retirement fund contribution, would be paid into a second pot, which must be preserved 100% until retirement. And not only that, on retirement, none of this money would be accessible as a cash lump sum. The entire 2/3 pot would have to be annuitized. Another important thing to note is that these two pots are anticipated to be transferable and to move with the member from fund to fund as and when they transfer, in the same way as we currently do with vested rights and unvested rights. But that brings me to my next point. So at its basic, we're looking at two pots, and we're talking about a two-pot system. But in effect, we currently already kind of have a two-pot system. So if we look at people who were members of provident funds and under 55 before 1 March 2021, these members would have one pot, which consists of vested provident fund benefits, and a second pot consisting of unvested provident fund benefits, which is made up of contributions that were paid into the fund after 1 March 2021. I'm not going to be talking about members who were over 55 on 1 March of last year, because that can create a whole lot of additional complexity. So let's just keep it simple for now and look at these members. So for members who are under 55 and were members of provident funds prior to 1 March 2021, they would have these two pots. And then on implementation of a two-pot system, they would have an additional accessible before retirement pot, as well as a preserved pot. So we're looking at a minimum of 4 pots. I am aware that some other providers are thinking about potentially having 5 or even 6 pots in some instances, but we're going to leave it at 4 just to keep it as simple as possible for now. On this slide, I have set out some summary of how the rules would work in relation to contributions, investment growth, pre-retirement withdrawals, and retirement in respect of each of the different 4 pots. But we don't have a lot of time here today, so I'm not going to go through this in any detail. You will be receiving these slides after the webinar, and if you have any questions or concerns about the summary, please let me know and we will address them. Right, there are some additional elements to the two-pot system proposal that I wanted to touch on. The first is that these rules, these two-pot system rules, would be applicable to all funds, including retirement annuity funds and preservation funds. Now, preservation funds are simple because they don't allow for any contributions, but you would have to provide for these rules in those funds so that transfers in can still observe the 2 different pots. With regard to retirement annuity funds, this can be a little bit contentious. As you already know, the amount that is saved in a retirement annuity fund must be preserved at this point in time 100% until retirement. So in a sense, we're giving retirement fund members more accessibility than they had before. However, on the backdrop of what happened during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that it's actually very important for members of retirement annuity funds to have some kind of accessibility. Many of those members may have lost their jobs over the last 2 years, and they wouldn't have any access to their retirement savings in those times of need. So government acknowledges that on the one hand, it is quite important to give such members access when they need it. In addition, government feels that it is simpler to have uniform rules across the board because it would be easier for members to understand. And then you also have to remember that 2/3 of all contributions will still have to be annuitized on retirement. So perhaps the net effect of the amount that's being annuitized in the end is more or less the same. The second additional element that I wanted to discuss is immediate access. The papers talk quite a lot about providing existing members of funds with some form of immediate access to cash on implementation of the new two-pot system. This is partly to counter for the struggles that many South Africans faced during the COVID-19 pandemic. But there are a lot of issues with this. The first being that it could create a run on retirement fund assets, which would be incredibly problematic, as well as the administrative burden that thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of claims would pose to both retirement fund administrators and SARS, who would have to process directives for each and every withdrawal. So I think most of the industry are not in favor of immediate access, but government are thinking of different ways in order to mitigate these risks. Some of those are limiting access to a specified percentage or rand value amount. And another option is potentially to allow members some sort of quid pro quo. And by this I mean, perhaps you could say to a member that they're entitled to access some cash if they put the entirety of their existing benefit into the 2/3 and 1/3 pot, thereby locking in 2/3 of their existing benefits, but giving them access to 1/3. So we'll see where this proposal goes, but considering that it's really focused on the financial stress created by the pandemic and the fact that it's unlikely that this new framework will come into force very soon, by the time the two-pot system comes in, it might actually be irrelevant to provide some kind of immediate access. So we'll just have to keep tabs on that and see how it goes. Right, so let's move on to the next item in my agenda, which is the taxation proposals that were set out in the two-pot system paper. Government has identified two major concerns with the current tax treatment that we currently have for retirement funds. The first is that the current tax treatment can benefit those with higher incomes to a greater degree than it benefits those with lower incomes. And that's simply because the amount of tax that is paid on a withdrawal or retirement is the same across the board, despite how much your income tax rate is. But individuals with much higher income tax rates are obviously getting more benefit from their deductions. The other issue is the potential for tax arbitrage. And this really isn't an issue with our current system, but if we were to implement a two-pot system, it could become an issue. And I'll explain this briefly. Basically, what government is worried about here is that an individual in a high income tax bracket, such as a 45% bracket, would be able to contribute an amount to their retirement fund, get the deduction on their 45% income tax bracket, and then withdraw that amount in the same tax year, where they would pay a maximum effective tax rate of 36%. So you understand the potential for avoiding tax there and the potential arbitrage that they want to avoid. So with this in mind, there are 4 proposals that are set out in the two-pot system paper in relation to tax. I'm not going to talk about the 4th one because that is maintaining the current system, and I'm sure that you all know very well how that works. So let's talk about the other 3. The first relates to adding withdrawals from the accessible pot to the individual's taxable income in the year of withdrawal. This would limit the potential for tax arbitrage, since if an individual received a deduction on the contribution and shortly thereafter made a withdrawal, it would be added back to their taxable income in that year. There are a lot of benefits to this, but the main drawback is that we wouldn't actually know how much tax as a retirement fund to deduct on withdrawal. So you might be looking at higher tax bills or tax refunds at the end of each tax year. The second tax proposal is to remove the deduction for contributions that are made into the accessible pot and have a benefit or withdrawal that is tax-free. So this is effectively the same as having a tax-free investment account within your retirement fund. There are a few benefits to this. We would no longer have to apply for tax directives on withdrawal, which would be great for us and probably great for SARS. But the removal of the deduction really does remove a very important incentive that we currently have, which incentivizes individuals to save more for retirement. And in my opinion, this is completely contrary to government's main intention, which is to encourage more savings and preservation. So there's an issue there. The third option is to implement a flat deduction percentage for all contributions and have the same flat rate of tax on withdrawals, or instead to add the withdrawal amount to taxable income. This would allow for equity, which is one of the problems that government has identified, and it would also do away with the potential for tax arbitrage. But it also comes with its own drawbacks. So we're going to be monitoring the tax proposals quite closely, and we'll have to see where National Treasury goes with this. At this point, they're just asking for input and feedback from the industry so that they can understand some of the practical issues that may arise within each of these proposals. Okay, so that brings me to the end of the two-part system paper, and we're going to talk very briefly now about the governance of umbrella funds. I'm going to give you just like a really brief overview because, as I said before, I don't want to go into too much detail. But basically, National Treasury is concerned about the poor governance of some umbrella funds, which creates poor outcomes for members. They have acknowledged that this only applies to basically a few bad apples, and that many umbrella funds in South Africa are very well governed and provide good outcomes to members. Broadly, the paper focuses on a few specific poor governance issues. Firstly, lack of member representation on boards. Secondly, lock-in provisions, where either employers are locked into a particular fund and find it difficult to transfer out, or funds are locked into taking their services from a specific service provider and can't select a better service provider when needed. They're also concerned about opaque and complex charges. And then lastly, the potential reluctance of funds to take action against delinquent employees because there may be some commercial conflict of interest there. If we look at these major issues that have been outlined in the paper, we're not really that concerned by most of them. In many instances, the paper fails to consider the current regulatory framework and existing legislation, which already provides for good governance. So we're of the view that for the most part, if funds apply the current legislative framework, and this is properly monitored by the FSCA, that there is sufficient legislation in place already to ensure good governance. Okay, so with that, we'll move on to my last topic for today, which is the offshore investment limits. Okay, as you will have noticed, it's been all over the press. During the budget speech, it was announced that the offshore investment limits would be increased. So prior to 23 February 2022, the offshore allowances for institutional investors, so collective investment schemes, life companies, and retirement funds, were not aligned with those applicable for Regulation 28 compliant funds. Regulation 28 compliant funds had an offshore investment limit of 30%, with an additional 10% that could be invested in Africa outside of South Africa, whereas institutional investors generally had an offshore investment limit of 40% with the 10% additional amount that could be invested in Africa. Moving forward, government has implemented a single limit of 45% of total retail assets under management that is applicable to all qualifying institutional investors. So this means that the offshore limits in terms of Regulation 28 and for institutional investors generally have been aligned. The 10% that could previously be allocated to Africa outside of South Africa has been rolled up into the general offshore limits. I'm aware that this is slightly different from what has been reported in some press outlets, but we have clarified this with ASISA, and the industry is aligned on the fact that it's a rolled up flat 45% offshore, which includes Africa. This also means that as local unit trust funds begin to tend towards more towards the 45% limit, life companies and collective investment scheme managers will need to be aware of how this will affect their overall capacity. So what does this mean for clients? It's actually quite simple. Members of retirement funds can now invest up to 45% of their savings in offshore anywhere outside South Africa. In addition, unit trust managers and life companies can invest up to 45% of their retail assets under management offshore. Please note that the current offshore restrictions applicable to the Allan Gray living annuity, endowment and tax-free investment products will not be adjusted immediately. We've considered this quite carefully, and we think that the new combined limit does not materially increase the available offshore capacity that we have in our life company, but we will communicate any changes on these restrictions as and when Allan Gray Life's available offshore capacity allows.